Have you ever walked into a room and felt invisible? Have you ever worked your hardest, only to be dismissed as if you were nothing? If you have, then you'll understand exactly how Isaac felt. Isaac Monroe was not just any man. He was the CEO of Monroe Industries, a billion-dollar logistics empire. But no one in the company knew his face. No one recognized the man behind the empire, and that's exactly how he wanted it. At 42, Isaac had built his success from the ground up. He wasn't handed a silver spoon, nor did he have the luxury of wealthy parents paving his way. He had clawed his way up from poverty, from nights spent in the back of a run-down car and mornings filled with empty stomach hunger. Hard work and ruthless determination had sculpted him into a businessman feared in boardrooms but respected by those who truly knew him. And yet, despite his empire, despite his power, something felt off. He had built Monroe Industries to stand for something: efficiency, reliability, respect for its workers. But whispers had reached him, disturbing stories of mistreatment within his own company. Warehouse workers being pushed past their limits, managers taking credit for others' labor, and executives treating those beneath them like disposable cogs. At first, he dismissed it. Surely, these were exaggerations. But something gnawed at him. He couldn't ignore it. He needed to see for himself. So, one morning, Isaac did something no one expected. He stripped away his power. He traded his $1,000 suit for a simple navy blue uniform, pulled a delivery cap low over his sharp features, and walked into his own company. Not as CEO, but as Isaac the delivery guy. No one noticed him. No one looked twice. And for the first time in years, Isaac Monroe disappeared into background. That's when the truth began to reveal itself. Would you have done the same in his place? Would you have dared to see how people really treat those they believe are beneath them? Isaac was about to learn a lesson he would never forget, and by the end of it, neither would they. Isaac had always believed that a company was only as strong as its people. Yet, as he moved through the halls of Monroe Industries disguised as a delivery worker, he saw a company that had lost its way. It started small, things an outsider might dismiss as normal workplace behavior. The way some executives barely acknowledged the warehouse staff, the way middle managers scoffed when workers asked for a break, the way people avoided eye contact with those they considered less important. But Isaac knew better. Small things always revealed the bigger truth. He spent the first few days doing simple tasks, delivering packages, restocking supplies, even sweeping floors when needed. He wanted to blend in, to feel what his lowest-ranked employees felt. The work was tough, but that wasn't what bothered him. It was the way people treated him. The first signs of corruption. The first real sign of trouble came when he delivered a package to the executive floor. He stepped into the sleek, modern office space, carrying a set of parcels marked for the higher-ups. The moment he arrived, the mood shifted. A receptionist, a young woman in a sharp blazer, barely looked up. "Drop it over there," she said, waving vaguely toward a corner without so much as a glance in his direction. Isaac hesitated. "These are confidential. I need a signature." She sighed, annoyed, as if even speaking to him was a waste of her time. "Then wait. They're in a meeting." Isaac nodded and stepped aside. He expected to wait 5, maybe 10 minutes. But the minutes dragged on. 10, 15, 20. Finally, a man strolled out of the glass-walled conference room, adjusting his Rolex. He was tall, sharp-suited, and wore an air of arrogance like a second skin. Richard Caldwell, one of Monroe Industries' top executives. Richard stopped when he saw Isaac, his expression twisted in irritation, as though the very presence of a delivery worker had ruined his day. "Why the hell is this guy standing around in here?" he muttered to another executive beside him. The man chuckled. Isaac stepped forward, holding out the clipboard. "I just need a signature for delivery." Richard stared at him, then at the packages. He scoffed. "You could have left it at the front. We don't have time to babysit delivery boys." Isaac forced himself to remain calm. He had dealt with men like Richard before, power-drunk executives who thought they were untouchable. But it was one thing to hear about it, and another to experience it firsthand. Company policy says confidential documents require a signature. Isaac said evenly. Richard rolled his eyes, but finally grabbed a clipboard. Unbelievable. First, you people are late, and now you're making demands. He signed with a flourish, then shoved it back. Next time, don't waste our time. The way he said you people made Isaac's blood boil. But he stayed silent. He had come here to observe, to learn. But what he saw next changed everything. The breaking point. Humiliation in the boardroom. A few days later, Isaac was asked to deliver a stack of reports to the boardroom during a quarterly strategy meeting. He stepped in cautiously, carrying the files. Laughter filled the air. Rich, full-bellied laughter from men who had never struggled a day in their lives. He saw Richard at the head of the table, surrounded by other executives, their suits crisp, their watches gleaming. And then, as if on cue, Richard's gaze landed on him. "Oh, look," Richard said loudly, smirking. "The help has arrived." The room burst into chuckles. Isaac, keeping his composure, walked over and placed the reports on the table. Richard wasn't done. "Hey, delivery guy," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Why don't you tell us? How does it feel working a real job?" More laughter. Isaac clenched his fists at his sides. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting for a reaction, waiting for him to feel small. "Must be nice, right?" Richard continued, his tone mockingly friendly. "No stress, no responsibilities, just carrying boxes all day. Probably makes, what, minimum wage?" Isaac's heart pounded. He could walk out, ignore it. But then he thought of the workers in the warehouses, the drivers out on the roads, the people who actually kept Monroe Industries running, the people these men sneered at from behind their mahogany desks. He met Richard's gaze and, for the first time, allowed himself to smile. "It's honest work," he said simply. Richard's smirk faltered, just for a second. "Honest work," he repeated, scoffing. "Well, good for you. Now get out of the way. The real businessmen are talking." The laughter roared again. Isaac felt a slow burn of anger coil inside him. They had no idea who he was. But they were about to find out. The boardroom still hummed with laughter, the air thick with arrogance. Isaac stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like an iron hand. The scent of expensive cologne mixed with freshly brewed coffee. The polished conference table gleamed under the LED lights, and through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline stretched endlessly. But inside this room, there was no respect. Richard leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers lazily against the table, as if he had already dismissed Isaac from existence. "Go on now, delivery boy. Don't keep your real job waiting." The words echoed in Isaac's mind, but he wasn't hearing them the way Richard intended. The humiliation wasn't his. It was theirs. Their ignorance. Their blindness. Still, he said nothing. He turned on his heel and walked toward the door, every step slow, deliberate. He could feel their eyes on him, expectant, waiting for the moment he slunk away, defeated. But then, just as he reached the door, he stopped. The room went silent. Isaac took a deep breath. The air in the boardroom was cool, but heat flared in his chest. He turned around, this time, not as a delivery man, but as the rightful owner of Monroe Industries. He cleared his throat, his voice steady. "You know what's funny?" he said, his gaze sweeping across the room. The executives exchanged looks, confused. Richard scoffed. "Oh, do tell," he said, still lounging in his chair like a king on his throne. Isaac stepped forward, placing both hands on the table, leaning in just slightly. His voice was calm, but beneath it was steel. "I built this company from nothing," he said, his words measured. "Spent years in the trenches. I know every inch of this business. Every contract, every supply chain, every worker who keeps it running." Richard's smile twitched. "What the hell are you talking about?" Isaac reached into his pocket and pulled out a small key card. The executive stiffened slightly, eyes darting to one another. Slowly, he slid it across the table. It stopped right in front of Richard. Richard frowned and picked it up. The moment his eyes landed on the name printed on it, the blood drained from his face. Isaac Monroe, CO. The silence that followed was suffocating. A few seats down, one of the other executives coughed awkwardly. Another cleared his throat. Richard, however, sat frozen. The air in the room had shifted completely. Just a moment ago, he had been the predator. Now he was nothing more than prey. Isaac straightened up, taking his time to button his sleeves, his movements unhurried, controlled. He could hear the nervous shuffle of papers, the subtle creak of leather chairs as some of the board members adjusted their posture. Finally, Richard found his voice. This is some kind of joke, he said, though his voice lacked the same bravado. Isaac tilted his head. Does it look like I'm laughing? Richard's jaw clenched. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious. Isaac turned to the rest of the board. For weeks, I've been walking to my own company, seeing it through the eyes of the people who actually keep it running. And what did I find? His gaze darkened. I found executives who treat their employees like dirt, men who sit in this room and make decisions that affect thousands, yet have no respect for the people on the ground. A few of the board members shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Isaac let the weight of his words settle before turning back to Richard. But you, he said, his voice quieter now, sharper, you were something special. The way you laughed. The way you looked down on the people who work harder in a day than you do in a year. The way you enjoyed it. Richard swallowed hard, but he still forced a smirk. All right, fine. You got me, he said, leaning forward. You played dress-up, had your little fun. But let's be real, Isaac. His voice dropped to a condescending whisper. You still need people like me to run this company. The arrogance was still there, clinging desperately to his words. Isaac nodded slowly. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a neatly folded stack of papers. He tossed them onto the table. Richard stared at them. What is this? He asked, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Isaac smiled. Your termination papers. Richard's face turned a shade paler. I'm not just firing you, Isaac continued, turning his gaze to the other executives. I'm cleaning house. His tone was almost conversational. Effective immediately, every single one of you is out. The shockwave that hit the room was almost physical. Gasps, protests, a flurry of voices speaking over one another. You can't do this. This is ridiculous. You'll regret this. Isaac held up a hand, and the room fell silent again. I built this company once, he said, his voice unwavering, and I'll do it again. But this time with people who actually care. Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You're making a mistake, he spat, his face red with anger. You think you can just replace us? We are Monroe Industries. Isaac chuckled, shaking his head. No, he said, stepping closer, until there was nothing but inches between them. The workers, the drivers, the engineers, the people in the warehouses, they are Monroe Industries. You, his voice dipped to a near whisper. You're just parasites. Richard's lips parted, but no words came out. Isaac turned away, walking toward the door, but just before stepping out, he glanced back over his shoulder. Oh, and Richard, he said, his voice laced with finality. Richard looked up, his eyes burning with rage. Isaac smirked. Security will escort you out. At that moment, 2 uniformed security officers stepped in, their presence looming. And just like that, Richard Caldwell, the man who had spent years sneering down at others, was finally forced to look up. The weight of silence hung heavy in the boardroom as the security officers stepped forward. Richard's face twisted in disbelief, his breath shallow. This is a joke, he hissed, eyes darting to the other board members. Someone tell him. You can't just walk in here and... No one moved. No one spoke. A few of the executives shifted uncomfortably, their expressions flickering between guilt and self-preservation. The power dynamic had shifted so suddenly, so completely, that they were scrambling to adjust. Some of them had laughed along with Richard just moments ago. Now, they avoided his gaze entirely. One of the security guards, a tall man with a build like a linebacker, took a step forward. "Mr. Caldwell, we need you to come with us." Richard's jaw clenched so hard it looked like his teeth might crack. "I built this company," he roared, slamming his fist on the table. "Do you have any idea what I've done for Monroe Industries? You wouldn't exist without me." Isaac raised an eyebrow. "Without you," he echoed. He stepped closer, his presence now towering over Richard. "I started this company with my own 2 hands. I worked every job, from the warehouse to the offices. I put in the hours while you sat in this room, treating my employees like garbage." Richard's breath came in short, furious bursts. "You're making a mistake, Monroe," he spat, his voice venomous. "You think you're a hero? You think this place will survive without us? You'll fail." Isaac exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "No," he said, his voice calm but firm. "The company was failing because of you." He turned to the rest of the executives. "The era of greed and incompetence ends today. I don't need people who only know how to sit in a room and make decisions that hurt the very people keeping this company alive." His gaze swept over them, his presence commanding. "Monroe Industries will survive, but only with leadership that understands what it means to build something, not just leech off it." Richard let out a bitter laugh. "You're naive," he sneered. "You'll regret this." Isaac smirked, shaking his head. "The only thing I regret," he said, "is that I let you sit in my company for this long." The security officers took another step forward, and this time, Richard realized there was no more room to fight. The color drained from his face. He took a stumbling step backward, his gaze darting around the boardroom, looking for a lifeline. But none of his so-called allies offered him one. The realization struck him like a slap. This wasn't just Isaac's doing. The people in the room, his fellow executives, weren't defending him, because in the end, they didn't respect him either. Richard opened his mouth, then shut it again, his face twisted with anger, humiliation, and finally, something dangerously close to fear. "Let's go," one of the guards said, his voice low but firm. Richard swallowed hard. For the first time in years, he was no longer in control. He turned and walked toward the door, his steps stiff, his entire body radiating barely contained fury. But just as he reached the exit, Isaac spoke again. "Oh, and Richard?" Richard froze. He didn't turn around. Isaac took a step closer, his voice smooth but unmistakably sharp. "You might want to check your email." Richard's shoulders tensed. He fumbled for his phone with shaking hands, swiping at the screen. His eyes flickered over the message at the top of his inbox. Termination notice. Immediate effect. Below it, a formal announcement of his dismissal was already being distributed to the company. Richard sucked in a sharp breath. But the worst part wasn't the email. It was the growing murmur outside the boardroom. Isaac had timed this moment perfectly. The office workers, the assistants, the interns, everyone who had been invisible to Richard but essential to Monroe Industries, were watching. Whispers spread like wildfire, faces appearing through the glass walls. Peering in as security escorted the once powerful Richard Caldwell out of the room. And then, the moment that sealed his downfall, someone clapped. A single, sharp sound. Then another, and another. The slow ripple of applause grew into something larger, more powerful. Employees, his employees, were cheering. Some whispered to one another. Others held back smiles. A few openly grinned. Richard's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles turning white. His steps quickened, as if he could outrun the humiliation. But he couldn't. For the first time in his life, Richard Caldwell was truly small. The doors closed behind him. And just like that, he was gone. The dawn of a new era. Isaac exhaled, letting the tension in his shoulders finally ease. He turned back to the boardroom, where the remaining executives sat in stunned silence. "Now," he said, straightening his sleeves, "let's talk about the future." Some of them shifted in their seats, still processing what had just happened, but one of them, an older man who had been sitting quietly through most of the meeting, nodded slowly. "I think it's about time for some real leadership." Isaac gave a small smile. "First order of business," he said. "We're restructuring. From now on, every department head will be expected to spend time in their departments. No more executive isolation. If you don't know the people working for you, you don't belong here." A few of the executives exchanged uneasy glances. "Second," Isaac continued, "salaries and bonuses will be reviewed, but this time the focus will be on fair compensation for all employees, not just the ones sitting in this room." That got a reaction. A few of them sat up straighter, realizing just how much things were about to change. Isaac turned to his assistant, a sharp-witted woman who had remained in the background during the confrontation. "Schedule meetings with the department heads. I want direct input from the people who do the work." She nodded, smiling, already on it. Isaac turned back to the board. "Anyone who has a problem with these changes," he said, "can hand in their resignation today." The room went quiet. No one moved, because deep down they knew this was no longer the same company. Monroe Industries was no longer a playground for the rich and entitled. It was his company again. Isaac Monroe had reclaimed what was his, and this was just the beginning. Isaac stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his office overlooking the city skyline. The weight of the day pressed down on him, but for the first time in a long while, it wasn't the weight of frustration or disappointment. It was something else, something lighter, something freer. The echoes of the past still lingered. He could still hear Richard Caldwell's voice, filled with arrogance and desperation. He could still feel the tension in the boardroom, the way the air had crackled with the weight of long-overdue justice. But most of all, he could still hear the sound that had marked the true shift in power, the applause, the validation of people who had been overlooked, mistreated, undervalued. He took a slow breath. Everything had changed today. But in truth, this transformation hadn't started in that boardroom. It had begun long before that, when he had first walked into his own company as an outsider, disguised in a delivery uniform, when he had seen, firsthand, the cracks in the empire he had built, when he had realized that power wasn't about the title on his office door, but about the impact he had on the people who relied on him. For years, he had trusted the wrong people, thinking they would uphold the same principles that had built Monroe Industries from the ground up. But power had corrupted them. Greed had blinded them. And in the end, they had forgotten the very thing that made a company strong. Not numbers, not stock prices, but people. The knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant, Maya, stepped in, her usual composed demeanor carrying an undertone of approval. "The news is already spreading," she said. "Employees are talking. Some are still in shock, but—" She hesitated, then smiled. "Most of them are relieved. They're hopeful." Isaac nodded. That was what mattered most. "What about the board?" he asked. "Some are rattled. A few might resign." She tilted her head. "But honestly, I don't think you'll have to push many of them out. They know the game has changed." "Good." Isaac turned back to the window, watching the city lights flicker against the darkening sky. Today had been a battle, one that had ended in victory, but he knew the war wasn't over. Rebuilding a company wasn't just about removing the rot. It was about planting something stronger in its place. That meant restructuring, regaining trust, proving that leadership wasn't just another word for control. It would take time. It would take effort. But Isaac Monroe had never been afraid of hard work. His mind drifted back to the warehouse, to the employees who had unknowingly spoken to their CEO as if he were just another worker, the man in shipping who had helped him carry boxes, the receptionist who had smiled at him even when she was exhausted, the delivery drivers who worked long hours for a paycheck that barely reflected their worth. They were the backbone of Monroe Industries, and he owed them more than just words. He turned back to Maya. Set up a company-wide town hall, he said. I want to speak to everyone, not just executives. No more decisions made behind closed doors. If I'm going to rebuild this company, I need them to know they're part of it. Maya's eyes gleamed with approval. Consider it done. She hesitated for a moment before adding, You did the right thing today. Isaac exhaled, a slow, measured breath. I did what had to be done. She nodded. Sometimes those are the same thing. As she left, Isaac allowed himself a rare smile. Today had been about justice, about reclaiming his company, not just from the wrong hands, but for the right people. But tomorrow would be about building something better. He didn't just want to lead Monroe Industries. He wanted to make it a place where no one ever felt invisible again. And that, he knew, was a legacy worth fighting for. Final thought. What makes a true leader? Is it power? Wealth? Control? Or is it the ability to lift others up, to see beyond titles and profits, and to build something that truly matters? Isaac Monroe had found his answer. What's yours?